Picture this: a strip of broken coral carved into a jungle island reeking of engine oil, rot and fear. Above it, the sky is a killing ground. Every time an American fighter climbs into that blue void, there is a chance it never comes back. Before we dive into the story of how one farm boy rewrote the rules of this deadly game, I would love your support. If you want more in-depth human stories behind the machines and battles of the Second World War, please consider subscribing to this channel and turning on the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Now let us go up to that sky over Guadalcanal where an American ace is about to discover just how outclassed he really is. On an October morning in 1942, 22-year-old Marion Carl was already an ace, already a hero, but none of that mattered 20,000 feet above Guadalcanal. Up there, all that mattered was the enemy on his tail. Carl was strapped into a Grumman F-4F Wildcat, a stubby, rugged carrier-based fighter that could take a beating but not much else. Chasing him was a Mitsubishi A6M0, a pale, almost delicate-looking machine that fought like something from the future. The Zero could turn inside the Wildcat's turning circle not once, but twice. It could climb like a rocket. For the better part of a year, that sleek Japanese fighter had dominated the skies from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, haunting American pilots like a ghost. Carl shoved his Wildcat into a dive, hoping weight and gravity would give him the one advantage his aircraft still possessed: speed. The heavy American fighter picked up momentum, the wind screaming over the canopy, but the Zero stayed with him as if it were attached by a string. Carl rolled hard to the right. The Wildcat responded slowly, mushy in the controls, lagging behind his desperate inputs. The Zero was already there, anticipating his move, sliding into position like a knife. Its cannons flashed. Carl's cockpit erupted in a storm of metal and glass. Shrapnel tore into his leg. The controls went slack in his hands. The Wildcat was no longer an airplane, only a falling piece of wreckage. With blood soaking his flight suit and the jungle spinning up toward him, Carl did the only thing left: he bailed out. The parachute blossomed above the broken sky, dragging him away from the dead machine. He hit the water hard. The sea around Guadalcanal was infamous, a place sailors whispered about, thick with sharks. Marion Carl splashed down in that shark-infested channel and survived only through a mix of skill, luck, and sheer stubbornness. His near death was not just a personal tragedy, it was a snapshot of the air war in the Pacific. This was the reality over Guadalcanal. On the ground, the Americans called their little patch of scraped coral Henderson Field. The newspapers back home gave its defenders a romantic name, the Cactus Air Force. The men who lived and flew there had a simpler word for it: the graveyard. Guadalcanal was not really a campaign, it was a meat grinder. Day after day, American pilots were fed into the teeth of the Japanese war machine, and day after day the same pattern repeated. Zeros appeared out of the sun dove through the formations, and American fighters spiraled down, trailing smoke. The problem, the experts insisted, was not courage, it was doctrine. The engineers and tacticians back in America had studied the Zero on paper. They understood that it was lighter, more agile, and more fragile than their own machines. The solution seemed obvious. Do not turn with a Zero. Ever. Use the strengths of the Wildcat. Dive. Use armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. Make one pass fire, and then run away. It was the same logic applied to the P-38 Lightning in other theaters. Fight in the vertical, never get sucked into a turning dogfight. On a chalkboard, that made perfect sense. In the real sky above Guadalcanal, it was getting men killed. The dogfights were not neat duels between textbook diagrams. They were chaotic, swirling masses of aircraft where friend and foe flashed past in split seconds. Japanese pilots were hardened veterans who had fought over China and at Pearl Harbor. They knew their mounts intimately, and they knew their enemies' limitations even better. They baited American pilots into turns, into hesitations, into small mistakes. They understood exactly how slow the Wildcat was to roll, exactly where its blind spots lay, exactly where to put a burst of fire. The result was brutal. The Americans were losing badly. What no one at Henderson Field knew was that the answer to this nightmare was already on its way, and it was not a new secret fighter and not a brand new manual from Washington. It was a 27-year-old farmer, a man who had once been told he was too old to fight, who had never learned to shoot from a range instructor but from chasing jackrabbits across frozen fields in South Dakota. His name was Joseph Jacob Foss. To understand how a single farmer could challenge the myth of the zero, you have to go back to the farm itself. Joe Foss was born in 1915 on an unelectrified homestead near Sioux Falls, South Dakota. His childhood did not unfold in clean classrooms or polished gymnasiums. It unfolded in mud and dust in winters, so cold they burned the lungs, and in winds that never seemed to stop. The narrator later compares his story to that of Simo Häyhä, the Finnish farmer who became a legendary sniper. In both cases you find small, underestimated men standing up against forces that seem invincible. Then the Great Depression hit South Dakota like an artillery barrage. The rains stopped. The land cracked. Crops withered in the fields. For families like the Fosses, there were no savings to fall back on, no safety net. There was hunger. That was when Joe's character, his Finnish-style grit, his sisu, was forged. He and his father took to the fields with old guns to hunt not for sport but for supper. Missing a shot meant wasting precious ammunition and possibly going hungry. It was a harsh school, but it taught lessons no academy could. By the time Joe was 12, his father trusted him with an old shotgun and a single rule: do not waste shells. The main quarry was the jackrabbit, a nervous, zigzagging blur of fur that never ran in a straight line. A jackrabbit would weave dartstop then jink the other way. If you aimed directly at it, you would always be behind. To hit it, you had to imagine where it was going to be, not where it was. Shot after shot, day after day, Joe Foss trained his eye and brain to lead a moving target. Without charts or equations, he began to do in his head what ballistics tables do on paper: estimate speed, angle, wind, and distance in fractions of a second. His father saw a boy learning to hunt. In reality, a future fighter ace was quietly mastering deflection shooting. This farmer's eye, the instinct to aim at empty space because that is where the target will arrive, sank deep into Joe's bones. It made him something more than a good shot. It made him a predator. But he did not want to spend his life chasing rabbits. In 1933, his father took him to an air show. There, a Marine Corps squadron of biplanes roared overhead, looping and diving. Joe looked up and felt something in his chest lock into place. He told his father very simply that this was what he was going to do. The path from a dirt farm to a cockpit seemed impossible. The family had no money. Schooling had been spotty. When a downed power line killed his father, 19-year-old Joe had to drop out entirely to run the farm and keep his family afloat. He was trapped by duty and by poverty, but he did not let the dream die. He worked the land by day and attended night classes whenever he could. It took him 6 long years to accumulate enough credits to enter college. He scrubbed dishes and took whatever jobs he could find to pay for flying lessons hour by hour, until he finally earned a pilot's license with his own hands. When Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, Joe Foss was 26 years old. He rushed to enlist in the Navy as a fighter pilot, convinced that all the sacrifice had been for this moment. Instead, he hit another invisible wall. Regulations set the age cutoff for fighter pilot training at 25. On paper, he was already too old. The Navy offered him a compromise: he could be a flight instructor, teaching younger men to do the thing he had trained for his entire life. It was a shattering blow, very much like the experts who had dismissed James McKenna's cable fix or told Simo Häyhä to use a high-powered scope that did not fit the reality of the battlefield. Joe accepted that verdict on the surface, but not in his heart. He found a loophole by joining the Marine Corps Reserve. He became an instructor, yes, but he treated it as a stepping stone, not a destiny. For 9 months he stood on the edge of war, teaching 20-year-old kids how to handle aircraft, how to dive, how to climb, how to shoot. He watched them ship out to combat while he stayed behind, grounded, simmering. The anger and frustration built until he could not contain it. He hounded his superiors, wrote letters, made himself, in his own words, the loudest and most annoying instructor in the service. Eventually, the system bent. They sent him to advanced fighter training and assigned him to a new squadron, Marine Fighting Squadron, 121. In October of 1942, as Marion Carl was being blown out of the sky by a Zero, the supposedly too old farmer from South Dakota boarded a transport headed for Guadalcanal. The place he found when he stepped off the plane hardly resembled the airfields he knew from training. The smell hit him first, a choking mix of hot engine oil, rotting jungle, and something metallic and sour that never quite went away. The runway was not a smooth strip of concrete, but a pock-marked smear of dirt and gravel hacked out of palm trees. The operations center was a wooden shack, nicknamed the Pagoda. The pilots slept in mud-floored tents. Everywhere shoved off to the side lay the wrecks twisted. Wildcats and P-39 fighters with torn-off wings, shattered engines and cockpits, stained by things no one wanted to identify too closely. Foss walked into the tent that would be his new home and met the men he would fly with. These were not the fresh-faced students he had trained back in the States. They looked like ghosts. Their skin had a yellow cast from the anti-malaria drug atabrine. Their eyes were red and hollow from nights of broken sleep. Their flight suits were soaked with sweat oil and fatigue. They were veterans, but they were also hunted. When they looked at Joe, they did not see a savior. They saw a replacement for the man whose cot had been empty the day before. New meat for the grinder. Out on the line, Foss was introduced to his Wildcat, a Grumman F4F that looked very much like the one Marion Carl had lost. It was solid and pugnacious, with thick wings stuffed full of machine guns and a reputation for durability. It also had another reputation against the Zero. It was a coffin with a propeller. The squadron executive officer, a man named Duke, walked Joe through the standard briefing that every new pilot received the same set of rules that had been written in blood over this island. Never turn with a Zero. Never. Use your speed. Use your armor. Dive, make your pass, and run. Joe Foss stood there in the heat, nodded, and said that he understood. Outwardly he accepted the doctrine. Inwardly he carried something else. No manual mentioned jackrabbits. No tactics lecture spoke of leading a target by feel, yet that was exactly what he had spent his entire childhood learning to do. The narrator later describes this as a mental modification every bit as real as James McKenna's piece of piano wire, but invisible to anyone looking only at the metal of the airplane. It had not yet been tested in this new sky, but it was waiting. The very next morning there was no gentle orientation flight. Joe Foss climbed into his Wildcat and went straight into war. Leading his first patrol, he hauled the heavy fighter up to 15,000 feet, the blue Pacific stretching beneath him, the jungle of Guadalcanal, a dark smudge on the ocean. The older pilots had warned him, the enemy comes out of the sun. You do not see them until they are firing at you. Foss scanned the sky, feeling strangely blind despite all his training. Then the radio crackled. Bandits high. He looked up and saw them neat dots above, spreading into the familiar predatory shapes of Mitsubishi Zeros as they dove. They were fast, far faster than anything he had chased in training. He remembered Duke's words, remembered the doctrine that had been drilled into him. Do not turn, dive, run. He pushed the stick forward and the Wildcat dropped into a screaming dive. The airframe shook. The engine howled. For a moment he believed the plan would work. A Zero slid into position behind him. Tracer rounds zipped past his canopy, close enough to make his whole body flinch. He held the dive all the way down, almost to the level of the treetops, using sheer speed and the thickness of the air near the ground to shake the pursuer. Somehow it worked. The Japanese fighter overshot, and Foss clawed his way back to Henderson Field alive. When the wheels thumped onto the rough strip and the engine wound down, the emotion that flooded through him was not relief. It was anger. The official doctrine had kept him alive, but only just. It had turned him into prey that escaped by inches rather than a hunter who could change the course of a battle. Looking at the wrecks lined along the runway, smelling the burnt oil and the rot, Joe Foss understood something that the engineers and tacticians far away had missed. You could not win a war in the air by spending every engagement running away. At best, you survived until the next sortie. And he had not come all this way, had not clawed his way out of the depression and across an ocean just to survive. He had come to Guadalcanal to fight, not to run, and fate gave him that chance almost immediately. On the 13th of October, Joe Foss led another patrol into the sky, still brooding over how close the previous mission had come to disaster. What began as a routine sweep became a violent storm of twisting metal. A formation of Japanese bombers appeared ahead, escorted by the slender silver shapes of Zeros that dropped on the Americans like hawks. The air dissolved into chaos. Planes spiraled dove and flashed past one another in a blur of noise and smoke. In the middle of that cyclone, Foss saw something that made his heart tighten. A Zero had slipped behind his wingman and was closing fast, lining up for a certain kill. The Japanese pilot had patience, confidence, and the perfect angle. A burst of cannon fire, and the young American would be gone. Doctrine demanded that Foss abandon the scene, dive away, and look for a cleaner shot. That was what the experts insisted. That was the safe option. But Foss felt something older, something born in fields far from this island. His father's voice, frozen in memory, echoed with the warning not to waste shells. His mind drew an instinctive line from the Zero's path to the patch of sky where it would be in one breath, maybe two. He rolled his Wildcat hard. The aircraft shuddered as if surprised by the sudden violence. He was not aiming at the Zero. He was aiming at the space in front of it, the way he had once aimed at a rabbit zigzagging across winter grass. He squeezed the trigger. The 6 heavy machine guns roared, spitting a river of fire into what looked like empty air. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the Zero flew directly into the moving wall of lead. The Japanese plane sheared apart as if struck by an invisible hammer, a wing tearing away in a glitter of metal. Flames bloomed and the aircraft tumbled into the sea below. It was Foss's first kill, and it changed everything. When his wheels hit the ground later that day, the ghosts of Henderson Field gathered around him. They wanted to know how he had done it. Foss did not give them a lecture. He gave them something better. He slapped the side of his battered Wildcat and told them it was a tough truck built to take punishment and built to shoot straight. He told them to throw away half the rules they had been given. Do not stare at the target, he said. Do not chase a Zero that is already ahead of you. Lead it. Imagine where it will be, not where it is. And when you think you have given enough lead, add a little more. Make the enemy fly into your fire. It was a simple explanation, even crude, but in the mouths of men desperate for any advantage, it sounded like revelation. It was the mental equivalent of the piano wire that had transformed the P-38 Lightning, a modification no engineer had designed yet, one that completely altered the machine's purpose. Within days, Foss had gone from newcomer to leader. The men saw that while he respected the Wildcat's weaknesses, he trusted its strengths, and he trusted the instincts that had carried him across a continent of hardship. With Marion Carl still recovering from his earlier shoot-down, the pilots began looking to Foss for direction. They were exhausted, outnumbered, and outgunned, but he was the only one talking about hunting instead of surviving. He inherited a group of 8 Wildcats, a ragged collection of new arrivals and misfits who lacked even a proper nickname. Reporters watching the strange assortment of personalities orbiting around this quiet farmer began calling them Foss's Flying Circus. The name stuck, and on the 16th of October, the circus went to war. The odds were almost comedic if they had not been so deadly. 8 Wildcats against 32 Japanese planes, but Foss had a plan that did not depend on outmatching the enemy's superior machines. He ordered his pilots to use the thatch weave, a tactic of mutual protection where 2 planes crossed paths to cover each other's vulnerable tails. The Americans dove into the formation. Foss spotted a Zero and did not attempt to turn with it. He pulled lead, felt the angles in his bones, fired, and watched the enemy explode. Another Zero dropped on him from above, but his wingman, weaving exactly as ordered, rolled over and fired a perfect burst that sent the attacker spiraling away. In less than 10 minutes of furious combat, the flying circus shot down 5 Japanese planes. Every one of Foss's pilots returned home. For the first time in months, Henderson Field tasted victory rather than mourning. The days that followed felt like watching a storm gather strength. On the 18th, Foss downed 2 more Zeros. On the 20th, he destroyed another. By the 23rd of October, a mere 10 days after his first kill, the farmer from South Dakota was officially an ace. 2 days later, he shot down 3 Zeros in a single day, a feat that ricocheted through every tent and trench on the island. The old man, the instructor who had been told he was too old for combat, had become the most feared pilot on Guadalcanal. Success, however, draws hunters of all kinds. Just as the Soviet snipers once tracked Simo Häyhä, Japanese aviators began tracking Joe Foss. Their commanders could not ignore the alarming pattern. Veteran aces, men who had dominated Chinese skies and stunned the world at Pearl Harbor, were falling to a pilot flying an aircraft they considered hopelessly inferior. Time and again, radio intercepts caught the same name, Foss. On the 7th of November, the Japanese made their move. Foss and his flight were jumped by an elite group of enemy pilots who descended like a storm through the clouds. The sky erupted into a maze of crossing trails. Foss shot down 2 Zeros in the opening moments. He was lining up for a third when cannon shells slammed into his Wildcat from behind. The cockpit filled with smoke. Flames licked the instrument panel. The engine shrieked. Foss bailed out, crashing through branches as he hit the jungle below. He was shaken but alive, and he was back in the air within 48 hours, refusing to yield the sky to anyone. But fate was not finished with him. On his next mission, he attacked a lone Japanese floatplane but forgot the one danger every pilot should remember: the rear gunner. A burst of fire hammered into his engine. The Wildcat died in an instant. Foss had no choice but to ditch in the ocean. The plane slammed into the water and sank in less than half a minute, leaving him alone in the slot, the narrow, current-filled channel considered one of the most shark-infested regions on Earth. He floated there, a tiny speck in a vast blue expanse, surrounded by fins slicing through the water. Sharks bumped him, nudged him, circled him in widening arcs. Foss stayed still, conserving strength, unwilling to give panic a foothold. For 4 endless hours he drifted the sun sinking behind the waves until a small canoe appeared on the horizon. Inside were native islanders sent by an Australian coast watcher who had glimpsed the crash. They beat the water with their oars to drive the sharks back and pulled Foss into the boat. By the time they reached land, he was feverish, exhausted, and only half conscious. Doctors at Henderson Field diagnosed malaria and exposure and immediately grounded him. The Japanese, hearing no new reports of his presence, felt certain he was dead. The ghost of Guadalcanal, as they had started calling him, seemed finally gone. But Foss was not done. For 2 weeks he lay shivering in his cot, racked by fever, staring at the canvas roof and thinking only of the jackrabbits that were getting away. He recovered enough to return to combat on the 30th of November. His body was not ready, but his will was implacable. Each time he lifted off, the fever simmered beneath his skin, yet he fought with the same predatory intuition that had carried him thus far. By the 15th of January 1943, his tally reached 23 confirmed victories. That put him within striking distance of the most sacred number in American aviation, 26. That was the record held by Eddie Rickenbacker, the legendary ace of the First World War, a record so revered that many believed it would stand forever. Yet there he was, a sick, shivering farmer flying a machine often mocked as a flying coffin, closing in on a benchmark pilots had worshipped for decades. Malaria ravaged him. Every landing left him drenched in sweat. His Wildcat returned riddled with holes so regularly that his ground crew stopped counting them. They sometimes had to lift him from the cockpit because the chills made his muscles tremble uncontrollably. And still he flew, driven by something deeper than pride or ambition. Perhaps it was stubbornness. Perhaps it was gratitude for every time the island had tried to kill him and failed. Or perhaps it was the simple, unwavering conviction of a man who had spent his life refusing to accept the limits others placed on him. Whatever the reason, Joe Foss kept climbing back into the fractured sky over Guadalcanal, hunting the Zeros that had once seemed like monsters from another world. He had already changed the course of the air war once. He was about to do it again. He had already changed the course of the air war once. He was about to do it again. By the time the 15th of January arrived, Joe Foss was a man held together by willpower more than by flesh. The malaria that had been gnawing at him flared harder than ever. His temperature spiked, his hands shook, and the medical staff at Henderson Field finally drew a hard line. They told him he was grounded, that he was too sick to stand, let alone strap himself into a fighter and wrestle with gravity and death. On any rational scale, they were right. But Foss had not crossed oceans and survived sharks just to lie helpless while others went up without him. That same day, word came in that a massive Tokyo Express convoy was steaming toward Guadalcanal, packed with ships, troops, and supplies, and screened by a heavy escort of fighters. The island's fate had never depended on a single battle, but this one would push every pilot and every machine to the edge. As the sirens sounded and ground crews rushed to ready aircraft, Foss dragged himself out of his cot, pulled on his flight gear with clumsy hands, and walked toward his Wildcat. The doctors shouted, the ground crew protested, but there was a tone in his voice that ended the argument. He was going up, so was the flying circus. They climbed into a sky already streaked with contrails, the horizon crowded with distant specks that grew larger and more numerous with every minute. Foss had flown many sorties, but he had never seen anything like this. Zeros and Wildcats, bombers and escorts all poured into the same patch of air. The battle was less a fight and more a storm, a churning cloud of machines that crossed and recrossed paths in a mad geometry. His vision blurred with fever and strain, but the hunter inside him was wide awake. Amid that chaos, he saw a familiar and terrifying pattern begin to form. A Zero had latched onto the tail of one of his wingmen and was closing in for the easy, merciless kill that had defined so many engagements before. The Japanese pilot held the perfect angle, easing in with predatory patience. On the ground, doctrine still insisted that Foss should break away and look for a cleaner shot. In the air, the farmer's eye refused to accept that. He rolled, judged the Zero's speed and turn almost without conscious thought, and fired not at the enemy but at the patch of sky where the enemy was about to be. His guns hammered for a heartbeat that felt like a lifetime. Once again the air looked empty where the tracers laced through. Then the Zero flew directly into the path of the bullets. Metal burst away from its fuselage, the engine coughed smoke and flame, and the fighter came apart in mid-air. That was victory number 24, another jackrabbit that had never seen the shot coming. There was no time to celebrate. The sky around him remained thick with danger. Foss scanned the melee and saw another Zero diving hard on a cluster of Wildcats, preparing to carve them open from above. This time he chose a different approach, one that he had refined over countless dogfights. Rather than chase straight after the enemy, he set up a high side pass, rolling his Wildcat above and offset from the Japanese fighter so that he could strike from its blind spot. The maneuver required nerve timing and absolute trust in his understanding of relative motion. He cut across the Zero's path, dropped down at an angle, and sent a short, precise burst into its engine. The Japanese fighter burst into flame and spun away. That was kill number 25. In that instant, Joe Foss had tied Eddie Rickenbacker's legendary record. For many men, that might have been enough. The mountain had been climbed, the unreachable summit touched. But the battle did not pause for symbolism. Foss's eyes found yet another target, a floatplane fighter, a roof trying to break free from the chaos and escape toward the open sea. The roof pilot pulled into a hard climbing turn, desperate to put space between himself and the slaughter behind him. Foss followed, but not in a straight pursuit. He rolled his Wildcat up and out, letting instinct draw a curved path through the sky. He did not aim where the roof was. He aimed along an invisible arc ahead of it, the same way he had once aimed at rabbits that doubled back at the edge of a field. He squeezed the trigger and held it, sending a long, arcing stream of fire into the empty blue. The bullets traced a graceful curve that seemed to hang in the air. The roof flew straight into it. Rounds punched through the cockpit and the floatplane shuddered, then tumbled end over end, falling toward the Pacific in broken spirals. That was kill number 26. In one fever-ridden mission, Joe Foss had matched and then surpassed the greatest American ace of the First World War. The record that had stood untouchable for decades now belonged to a farmer in a Wildcat. When Foss brought his battered fighter back to Henderson Field, the news had already outrun him. The airstrip that had been a graveyard for so long felt almost like a village waiting for a returning champion. Ground crew pilots and staff crowded the edge of the runway. As his Wildcat rolled to a stop and the engine shut down, men swarmed the aircraft. They pulled open the canopy, unstrapped the shaking pilot, and lifted him bodily from the cockpit. For a few brief moments, the horrors of Guadalcanal were pushed aside by pure, unfiltered joy. They carried him on their shoulders, cheering, shouting his name, marveling at what he had done. The same ground that had swallowed so many wrecks now felt like a field of victory. Far away in Rabaul, the mood was very different. Officers of the Japanese High Command pored over reports with tightening jaws. For months, their pilots had spoken of the A6M0 as if it were charmed, a machine that could not be matched if flown properly. The doctrine was simple and had worked so many times. Force the Wildcat to turn slide behind it, fire, and watch it die. Now experienced aces were returning pale and shaken, describing something they struggled to name. They talked about American pilots firing at nothing, about wildcats refusing to run, about unseen bullets that materialized exactly where a zero would be a moment later. There was no easy line in a manual to explain this. In mess halls and ready rooms aboard carriers and at island bases, Japanese pilots compared notes. Again and again the same troubling pattern emerged. Wildcats that should have fled instead held position or rolled unpredictably. Shots that should have missed struck home. The Americans seemed to be pulling the trigger at the wrong moment, aiming at empty sky, and yet zeros exploded beside them. Intelligence officers tried to make sense of it, but every explanation ran into the same wall. On paper, in performance charts and turn radius graphs, the zero still held the advantage. And yet somewhere over Guadalcanal, an invisible modification had crept into the air war, one not made of metal or wiring, but of changed habits and changed minds. The narrator would later compare this shift to what Simo Häyhä had done to Soviet snipers in the snow of Finland. Simo had taken away their confidence by hiding his scope's glint and his breath, making himself a ghost that rules and manuals did not anticipate. Joe Foss did something similar in the air. By never aiming at the target itself, by hiding his intentions inside those deflection shots, he made his attack path unpredictable. Japanese pilots could not read his moves because they were not watching a man chase them. They were watching a hunter set a trap in the space ahead of them. Every time a zero disintegrated after flying into an apparently misplaced burst of fire, another stone was chipped away from the foundation of their doctrine. As confidence eroded, the entire dynamic above Guadalcanal shifted. The Cactus Air Force, once the hunted party, began to act differently. Pilots who had learned from Foss started thinking in terms of ambushes and angles rather than desperate dives and retreats. They used the thatch weave not as a last resort but as an opening move, presenting a constantly shifting web of overlapping fire. Zeros that once dove into these formations expecting easy prey now found themselves walking into carefully prepared kill zones. The hunters had become wary, the hunted had become predators, but nothing in war comes without a price. Shortly after breaking the record, Foss's body finally demanded payment for every hour he had stolen from sickness. The fevers that had once ebbed and flowed surged into a permanent blaze. His weight dropped until the man who had arrived on the island as a solid farm boy became a gaunt, hollow-cheeked figure. The same ground crew who had once hoisted him in triumph from his cockpit now struggled to help him stand at all. At last, even he had to accept the unavoidable. He could no longer fly. There was no grand farewell ceremony, no neat closing chapter. One day he was leading the flying circus into battle. Soon after he was strapped to a stretcher and carried to a waiting transport. The men watched their ace depart, not as a lord of the air, but as an invalid. Yellowed by atabrine, ravaged by malaria, and worn thin by months of strain, he left Guadalcanal as a shadow of the man who had saved it. Yet the legacy he left behind filled every tent, every cockpit, and every briefing board. Foss spent months in a naval hospital in San Diego, his body slowly repairing what the island and the disease had tried to destroy. While the war moved on without him, the nation he had served did not forget. On the 18th of May, 1943, Joe Foss stood in the White House, still bearing the marks of his ordeal. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt placed the Medal of Honor around his neck, citing his dauntless courage and incomparable skill in combat. The medal recognized his 26 confirmed victories in 44 days, a record of destruction that shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility in the air. Yet numbers alone were not his true achievement. The deeper legacy lay in the minds of the men who flew after him. Before Joe Foss, the Zero had been a monster wrapped in mystery, a symbol of an enemy that seemed always one step ahead. After him, it was still dangerous, but it was no longer untouchable. The farmer from South Dakota had proved that with the right tactics and the right mindset, an American pilot in a supposedly inferior machine could not only survive but dominate. His farmer's logic, refined over countless hunts and dogfights, seeped into the bones of the Pacific Fleet. Deflection shooting ceased to be a strange personal quirk and became a core lesson. The thatch weave, once an experimental tactic, became standard practice, a trusted way to turn two fighters into something much greater than the sum of their parts. Young pilots who had never seen Guadalcanal were trained to think in terms of future positions rather than present ones, to trust geometry and instinct over rigid formulas. In this way, Joe Foss helped tilt the balance of the entire Pacific War, not by designing new aircraft, but by teaching men to use the aircraft they already had in a new way. When the guns finally fell silent and the Second World War drew to its painful conclusion, Foss did not remain in uniform for life. Instead, he went home back to South Dakota, the land that had formed him. Unlike James McKenna, whose crucial modification remained obscure, or Simo Häyhä, whose legend grew quietly in foreign forests, Foss's heroism was widely publicized. Yet fame did not pull him away from his roots. He entered politics, serving in the state legislature, bringing the same practical, unsentimental perspective he had used in the cockpit to the business of governing. In 1954, the people of South Dakota elected him governor, choosing the farm boy who had once been told he was too old for combat to lead their state. He served them as he had served his squadron, with steadiness and a sense of duty. Later, he became the first commissioner of the American Football League, helping to shape a new era of professional sport in the United States. Photographs from that period show him in suits rather than flight gear, surrounded by players and executives rather than ground crews. But the expression is familiar, calm, focused, and faintly amused. The narrator places Joe Foss alongside James McKenna and Simo Häyhä as part of a small, crucial brotherhood of rule breakers. McKenna spotted fatal slack in a control cable on a P-38 Lightning and fixed it with a piece of piano wire, saving pilots who would never know his name. Simo rejected the powerful scope that doctrine favored and chose iron sights that suited his snowy battlefield, turning himself into a near-invisible spectre. Foss looked at the Wildcat and understood that he could never outturn a Zero, but he could outthink it. Each man saw a flaw that official doctrine had missed. Each quietly chose to break the rules in order to fix reality. Joe Foss lived long enough to see his story become part of the larger tapestry of the war. He died in the year 2003 at the age of 87, and he was buried with full military honors. Marines, aviators, and civilians alike remembered him not only as an ace of aces, but as a symbol of something older and tougher than any single battle, the stubborn, unyielding grit of the American farmer. His life embodied that almost untranslatable concept of sisu, the relentless will to push forward when everything says stop. Stories like his, and like those of McKenna and Simo, are easy to lose in the vast scale of the Second World War. Tanks and fleets and nations can overshadow the individual choices that quietly bend history. That is why telling these stories matters. Every time you choose to listen, to share, to talk about a man like Joe Foss with a friend or a family member, you help keep the signal from fading under the noise. Somewhere out there, veterans and history enthusiasts, students and casual viewers, people from small towns and big cities, are all part of the same invisible circle connected by these forgotten pages. And as long as we remember the individuals who dared to break the rules in order to do what was right, the sky over Guadalcanal and the farm fields of South Dakota will not fall completely silent.